The Second Battle of Zurich was a key victory by the Republican French army in Switzerland led by André Masséna over an Austrian and Russian force, commanded by Alexander Korzakov near Zurich. It broke the stalemate that had resulted from the First Battle of Zurich 3 months earlier and led to the withdrawal of Russia from the Second Coalition. Most of the fighting took place on both banks of the river Limmat up to the gates of Zurich, and within the city itself. Background: after the First Battle of Zurich, Masséna had consolidated to a defensive line behind the lower reaches of the Aare River. At this time his entire army in Switzerland consisted of around 77,000 combatants, positioned as 1st Division in the Upper Valley and the Simplon Pass, 2nd Division in the St. Gothard and the Valley of the Reuss, 3rd Division right wing near Glarus, centre on the left bank of the Linth, the left near Adlerswil on the Sihl, 4th Division on the Uetliberg, 5th Division on the left bank of the Limmat between Altstetten and Baden, 6th Division from Baden to the confluence of the Aare with the Rhine, 7th Division formed the reserve in the Fricktal, 8th Division at Basel. Following the overall strategic plan, the Austrian army under the Archduke Charles was to be augmented by the 25,000-man Russian command of Korzakov, newly arrived at Schaffhausen after a 90-day march. Masséna meanwhile was preparing an offensive on his right flank against the Austrian positions in the Alps. On 15 and 16 August General Claude Lecourbet with 12,000 men drove the forces of Strauch and Simpson from the St. Gothard, Furka and Oberalp passes in a series of violent assaults. As a distraction, on 14 August French forces under Soult made demonstrations across the Sihl below Zurich. On the night of 17th Archduke Charles, supported by Korsakov's troops, launched a surprise attack over the river Aare at Großdottingen using boats and pontoon bridges. But his engineers misjudged the strength of the current and depth of the river. The pontoon bridge was unable to be secured and eventually, after serious fighting, the attack was called off. Archduke Charles and Korzakov planned no further joint action, however, as following the strategic plans of the Austrian Hofkriegsrat under Baron Thugut, Charles had been ordered to move his main command north into southern Germany. Reluctantly following these instructions, he left behind a column of 29,000 men under Friedrich von Hotzer, and Korsakov's command with the Swiss in the Austrian service. The plan for these two commands was to wait for the arrival of the Russian column of Suvorov penetrating north from Italy over the Alpine passes and trap Masséna in a three-point encirclement. Initial situation. On the 22nd of August, Korzakov and Hotzer agreed that the Russians with 22,000 men would line the lower reaches of the river Limmat, and Hotzer with 20,000 men would occupy the Obersee region below Lake Zurich from the Linth to Glarus. On the 28th of August, the bulk of the troops of Archduke Charles departed Switzerland. Korzakov himself arrived in Zurich the following day, quickly displaying a vain overconfidence in the capabilities of his troops and disregard both for the French and his allies the Austrians. The presumption and arrogance of Korzakov were carried to such a pitch, that in a conference with the Archduke Charles, shortly before the Battle of Zurich, when that great general was pointing out the positions which should in an especial manner be guarded, and said, pointing to the map, "Here you should place a battalion." "A company, you mean," said Korzakov. "No," replied the Archduke. "A battalion." "I understand you," rejoined the other, "an Austrian battalion, or a Russian company." Sir Archibald Allison. At the end of August the Allied army stood as follows: Korzakov with 33,000 men around Zurich and the lower Limmat, distributed as Division Lieutenant General Gorchakov, brigades of General Major Tujkov and General Major Essen at Wollishofen, total with gunners 10,330 men. Division of Lieutenant General Durasov, Brigade of General Major Markov in a camp before Weining in opposite Dyatikon, Brigade of General Major Pushchin in a camp at Wernluzern in front of the village of Wettingen, 2,500 infantry, 1,000 Cossacks, along the right banks of the Limmat from Baden to the Rhine, total with gunners 7,052 men. The cavalry and Cossacks under Major General Gudovich were distributed on the Rhine along the line of the road from Zurich to Baden. Reserve Division Lieutenant General Sacken, 5,700 men initially in a camp at Regensdorf, then along the north bank of Lake Zurich connecting to Hotzer, Nauendorf, with 5,400 Austrians, on the right bank of the Rhine between Waldstadt and Basel. Hotzer with 25,000 Austrians, including 3,000 Swiss, between Uzneshticher and Decentis. Suvorov with 28,000 Russians on the march from Italy through the Alps. Shortly before the battle, Korsakov detached Sacken's 5,000-man reserve division to Rapperswil to reinforce Hotzer in anticipation of Suvorov's approach, consequently weakening his defensive line along the Limmat before Zurich and exposing his line of communications. The departure of Archduke Charles gave the French a momentary superiority in numbers. Masséna was determined to exploit this and the redistribution of Austrians and Russians. His aim was to beat Korsakov and Hotzer before any intervention by Suvorov. On 30 August he attempted to cross the Aare and push back the enemy before Zurich. This river crossing was unsuccessful, and Masséna now planned a crossing near Dyatikon with a subsequent attack on Korsakov in Zurich. On 19 September, Masséna revealed his plan to his division commanders. Lorge's division and part of Menard's would cross the Limmat from Dyatikon and attack Korsakov in Zurich. The remainder of Menard's command would occupy the enemy by demonstrating at Vogelsang. At the same time, Mortier's division was to hold the attention of Korsakov's main body in front of Zurich by attacking Wollishofen. Klein was to cover the Alstetten road, while the division of Soult was to cross the Linth at Bilten and prevent Hotzer from assisting the Russians. All the boats available for transportation were assembled at Brugg, while a pontoon bridge was constructed at Rottenschwil to mislead the enemy as to the point of crossing. Since June, French boats had been gathered from different waters and transported over land and water. By September 37 boats of different types were gathered in secret near Dyatikon. Under cover of the night of 23–24 September, Artillery General Dieden dismantled the pontoon bridge at Rottenschwil and transported it by convoy across the mountain to Dyatikon. On 24 September news came that Suvorov's troops had finally conquered the Gotthard Pass. This delayed success for the Russians made the joint attack of Korsakov, Hotzer and Suvorov impossible, but it persuaded Masséna to bring forward his attack from 26 to 25 September, the crossing of the Limmat. On the evening of 24 September, Masséna's troops concentrated at Dyatikon amounted to more than 8,000 men of Lorge's infantry division and 26 guns, all laying silently in the vicinity of the river. On the other side of the Limmat between Wernluzern and Wippkingen, they were faced by only 2,600 Russians under Major General Markov, including 1,100 men under Markov himself in Utwil-Wernluz, 290 men and 2 guns of the Misanov Cossack Regiment between the rise of the Monastery Drive and the Pine Woods, 220 men of a Grenadier Battalion on the western edge of the Pine Woods and 4 squadrons of dragoons, with 550 men under Colonel Shepelev at Wippkingen. On 25 September at 4:45, as boats were rapidly launched to cross the Limmat, the alarm was raised, and initial shots fired by a battalion of Garzen's advance guard brigade signaled the beginning of the attack. With prompt efficiency, approximately 600 men in 37 boats crossed the Limmat and formed a bridgehead on the opposite bank. The crossing of the boats alerted the weak Russian outposts on the opposite bank, but despite several rounds of musketry and artillery, not a single boat was sunk, or a man drowned. At this point the Limmat sweeps back in a wide arc to the south, allowing Masséna's artillery to fire from both sides of the river bend on the landing and deeper beyond the bridgehead. 25 shots hit various buildings of the monastery. As more French crossed, firing from the left bank ceased in fear of hitting their own men, and all effort was placed into traversing the river. At 500, Deepens directed the erection of the pontoon bridge. The French bridgehead was exposed to Russian artillery fire from the heights of Closterfar and the Pine Woods. This plateau, defended by 7 guns and Markov's reserves, was forthwith attacked, and after hard fighting by 600 the Russians were driven back, Markov wounded and taken prisoner. Barely an hour after the first shots, the French had crossed 800 men and were in possession of the Pine Wood and the Russian camp. Behind them the pontoon bridge was rapidly assembled and completed at 7:30. By 900 the entire division of Lodge was on the right side of the Limmat with 8,000 men and a total of 26 guns. Masséna aimed to prevent the Russian right wing under Jurasov joining their left at Zurich, and now quickly sent Bontemps with his brigade to gain the slopes of the mountains of the Glatt and cut the communications between Regensburg and Zurich. Bontemps' left was covered by 2 battalions of Quetard's brigade on the Wern-Luz road. All the other troops, some 15,000 men including the advance guard under Garzon, followed Chief of Staff Nicolas Oudinot in the direction of Honk. Mortier's attack. Meanwhile, at 500 Mortier's division had launched its feint attacks against Korsakov's main command. His left under Brunet advanced to the small plateau at Wiedikon, where they were soon pinned down by superior forces. His right under Drouet drove the Russians from Wollishofen, but were soon counter-attacked by Gorchakov's 6 battalions, assisted by William's flotilla of gunboats, and pushed back towards the Uitli. Gorchakov, however, not satisfied with merely repulsing the enemy attack, pursued the French to the Uetliberg and succeeded in capturing some batteries. This gain was, however, to contribute to the day's disaster, as the French success on the right bank, together with Klein's advance from Alstetten onto the Silfeld plain, enfiladed the right of the Russian corps, obliging Korsakov to withdraw it at 1300. The Russians fought with their accustomed bravery, but they were not well directed, and it was pathetic to see them charging up the slopes of the Albis expecting to see Suvorov at the top and calling on his name, Ramsey Weston. Phipps. Closely pursued as they retreated, Gorchakov's men suffered considerable loss. Menard's feint. The river crossing over the Limmat was successful as the Russians were too weak in the front section, and because they had been distracted away from Dietikon with feints by Mortier's division at Wollishofen and Menard's division at Vogelsang. Menard had succeeded in completely outwitting the Russians with his attack and also demonstrations against Braug. From daybreak he had opened a baggage of artillery fire with all his guns in the vicinity of Baden and at the confluence of the Aare and Limmat, against Jurasov's forces, spread his remaining brigade out in full view of the enemy, and put into motion the remaining boats on the river. Jurasov was completely duped by this, and stationed his troops nearly the entire day between Frey and Wilhelmshaven. By the time he realized his mistake and marched to rejoin troops on the heights of Oetlikon, he found the passage barred by Bontemps' brigade, and had to make a substantial detour to Zurich, where he arrived late at night. At Vogelsang, Menard succeeded in throwing a small detachment over the Limmat on boats transported overland from the Aare while under fire. This enabled him to re-establish a flying bridge, with which he crossed part of his command the next morning. Battle closes on Zurich. In Zurich, Korsakov had felt himself perfectly secure, to the extent that he hadn't made a single inspection of the line, nor had he removed his baggage or hospitals to a safe distance. Everything was left jumbled up in Zurich itself. Roused by the cannonade, he rode out to Hongg with a small detachment of troops and learned of Markov's defeat. Nevertheless, he was convinced that the crossing of the Limmat was merely a demonstration, and that the main threat came from Mortier's attack on Wollishofen. By 1000 the French were advancing on both banks of the Limmat, supported by a heavy artillery barrage. Oudinot seized Hongg and the Wipkingen heights from the weak detachment left by Korsakov, then, joined by part of the reserve. Shortly before 1500 he began attacking the Zurichberg, held by several Russian battalions. Garzon marched to Schwemmendingen to cut the road to Winterthur. By this time Korsakov had finally become aware of his dangerous situation and withdrew troops from the right bank through Zurich to face the advancing Oudinot. However, they could only do this by filing through the narrow streets of the town, jammed with wounded and baggage. A barrage of howitzer shells from the French further increased the confusion and impeded the Russians even more. By the time they had cleared Zurich, it was too late. The French had gained the mountain on that side of town and on the plains took possession of the Beckenhof country house. The Russians attacked bravely, but could make no impression on the troops of Lorges, supported by the Helvetin Legion. In the meantime, 4 Russian battalions sent back to Zurich by Hotzer arrived. Korsakov put himself at their head and with the help of Bachmann's Swiss Legion drove back the French to the foot of the heights of Wipkingen. Garzon, however, held on at Schwemmendingen. The Russian counterattacks against the Zurichberg, though incredibly brave, were inadequate in number and, instead of gaining the heights, the troops kept fighting before the gate, and charging the enemy with the bayonet among the vines and hedges, in a ground which did not admit of such an operation. As night drew on, Korsakov shut himself up in Zurich, having conceded the plains to the French. Masséna summoned the town but received no answer. Soult's attack against Hotzer. While all this was going on around Zurich, at the eastern end of Lake Zurich, the Austrian corps of Hotzer faced the French division of Soult in the channels and marshes around the lower Linth and the Walent Sea. For days beforehand Soult had dressed himself in an ordinary infantryman's uniform and performed outpost duty to observe the Austrian positions. At 2:30 a.m. on the 25th, a small group of soldiers, stripped to their underclothes, with pistols and ammunition tied above their heads and swords in their teeth, swam and waded across the channel near Scanis, from where they were able to pull up rafts with ropes, and under the darkness and a thick mist which lingered all day, a whole battalion was ferried across before the alarm was raised. Similar crossings were made at Schloss Grinor and Skamerikon. At 4:00 Hotzer was woken by the noise of artillery fire and rode out to find his troops fighting bravely at Scanis. He then rode with his chief of staff towards Wesson to reconnoiter, but in the fog they ran in with French troops concealed in a wood. As the 2 Austrians turned to flee, they opened fire and both men were shot dead. News of the death of Hotzer spread quickly and the dismayed Austrians, now under the hapless command of Franz Petrasch, fell back towards Lichtensteig, abandoning their small flotilla of boats at Rapperswil. Further east still, Soult's right wing had been attacked by the Austrian far left flank columns under Ulachik and Lincoln on the upper Linth, who were unaware of the bigger battle unfolding. The French 84th Demi-Brigade held on behind the Linth all through the 25th, then counter-attacked on the following day, encouraged by the defeat of Hotzer, and drove the Austrians back towards Wallenstadt. Actions on the 26th of September. During the night, Korsakov was finally joined by Jurasov's troops, and by the corps returned by Hotzer from the Linth. Now mustering 16 battalions, Korsakov was determined to hold his position at Zurich until he could be joined by Suvorov. That morning he received the news of the death of Hotzer. Facing the Russians, Oudinot assembled all the troops on the right bank to attack the Zurichberg. Bontem's brigade was to block the Winterthur road on the left. Lorge was to march along the Limmat to connect with the attacks of Klein and Mortier, who in their turn would advance by the Silfeld with Masséna at their head. By cutting the retreat of the Russians they would be driven into the lake. At dawn the Russians launched a powerful attack against Lorge's division in two lines, which succeeding in driving back Bontem's brigade and retaking the Winterthur road, thus foiling the plan to drive them into the lake. This was very fortunate for Korsakov, as at that moment Klein and Mortier were bombarding Klein-Zurich, and Oudinot's ordnance breaking in the Honk Gate. Terrible confusion reigned in the confines of the town. Korsakov proposed a parley, but no one paid any attention. Instead the Russians began a general retreat, leaving only a weak rearguard in the town, though he made no effort to prevent the withdrawal. Masséna advanced Deden's light artillery to successive positions to fire on the left flank of the retreating column, which spread complete disorder through their ranks. Masséna then ordered Lorge, Bontem's and Garzon to charge the center of the Russians, who defended themselves with desperation. Generals Sakin and Lykotsukin were severely wounded. The troops fought in isolated pockets without cohesion of any sort. At the same time Oudinot broke through the Limmat Gate, still defended by the Russian rearguard, while Klein stormed through Klein-Zurich with the reserve. There was no pursuit and the Russians were able to retreat without further interference. However, Korsakov determined to continue withdrawing with undiminished speed as far as the Rhine, and beyond. Wickham claims that the greater part of the Russian command were able to reach Eglisau unmolested by the French. Nevertheless, by the time Korsakov finally reached the Rhine with 10,000 remnants via Bulak and Eglisau, he had lost 8,000 men, including 5,200 prisoners, 100 guns, his military chest and records.